And I think Bart Ehrman says that that we can't use the historical method for miracles, right?
Yeah, I disagree with that. But it's important to point out that she explicitly says that she presupposes that the Gospels, first of all, were written by eyewitnesses, right? Like she even thinks, for example, that the Gospel of John was written by John, the son of Zebedee, which even like very conservative evangelical scholars don't think, and that they intended to tell what actually happened, which is fine as a presupposition. But the problem is that you then have to allow in evidence against, which isn't what she's doing. Like she's basically extremely happy to come up with any excuse to defend that presuppositions against all evidence, as we'll see.
Yeah. Yeah, this goes against the historical method, does it not? Like, can it be done? That's another way of saying, is it possible to
Yeah,
harmonize?
exactly. Yeah, so I think we should maybe introduce like what the context is, right? So there is this ongoing like disagreement between like on one hand Mike Lacona and on the other hand this Star Wars Muppet about what to do with apparent contradictions in the Gospels, right? So Lydia McGrew is a big fan of very old-fashioned additive harmonization. So just like smash the two narratives together, harmonize away any contradictions any way you can. And Lacona realizes that this is actually extremely ad hoc. Like, and you can see, sometimes even hear it when apologists are talking about it, that they are like they sound embarrassed when they have to think like, well, maybe Judas hanged himself like above a rock, and then when the rope broke, he like hit the rock, and that's why he
Yeah, I
fell
got that clip.
headlong.
I got that clip. I think ready to go, or at least.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So the point is, like, lot of apologists realize that these harmonizations sounds really dumb. So Mike Lacona just sort of he had a genius idea because he realized that it was very common in ancient literature to like be narratively flexible, which means authors could like tweak their narratives and stuff like that, which you can use that to explain away the contradictions because you can say, yeah, they changed the narratives and different authors changed it differently, but they were still reliable because that's what people did back then. And Lydia McGrew is obviously pushing against it because if this was the case, then it lowers our confidence in what the gospel's actually saying massively, and it should. So that's just the context. Yeah, and you just said that this is against the historical method. Well, the biggest problem is that like she completely ignores how probable the harmonization is, right? She's extremely happy. You can see the smile, like the dopamine rush that she gets every time she comes up with a way to harmonize these accounts, because she thinks she's defending the historical reliability of the gospels, right? The problem is that you have to, first of all, it's extremely ad hoc because we have no independent evidence for these particular resurrections being harmonizations being the case, but also she completely ignores how probable they are, right? Like people like Lacona don't push back against harmonizations because they think they can't be done. They push back against it because they have actual training in the historical method, and they realize that in order for the gospels to be historically reliable, all of the different harmonizations would have to be true at the same time. So the probabilities multiply, right? So it becomes much more probable than the alternative explanation of, yeah, the authors probably like invented some details or they just used some narrative devices to report something that a camera wouldn't be able to record.
I think you just already answered this, but in my notes I have a question. Like, why do you think guys like the Christian guys like Dr. Keener and Dr. Lacona can easily admit that John, for example, tweaked his gospel, or that just gave a gist, and that these are not exact words? Why do you think they can do it and Lydia can't use that terminology?
Yeah, and just think about the optics, right? Like this looks terrible to fence-sitting Christians. These guys arguing because they are all evangelicals. These guys arguing in between each other, like that does more damage to Christianity than what we are doing right now. Because when ordinary Christians hear about it, they have to think, what's going on here? Like even our guys can't agree. how reliable the Gospels are, right? Because the example she's giving is relatively mild, but if you actually go down the list of various things that these evangelicals like Lycona are saying didn't probably happen, it's a very long list, and it's got very important stuff in it, including, for example, some of the details in the resurrection appearances. So I completely understand why Lydia is pushing against this school of thought, right? Because it's really counterproductive. It might be a time to show the flowchart number 1. And this is why so basically what's going on, right? So Lacona is saying, look, it's more probable that there were, like, the discrepancies can be explained using the common literary devices that were used by the authors back then than like a bunch of ad hoc implausible harmonizations, because we know that this is what the ancient authors did. But because Lydia likes harmonizations, she goes through Plutarch and she finds out, I can't see any literary devices. So I'm wondering, why is that? And this is a flowchart from her book that she uses, right? And the problem is that the standard she has for concluding that there in fact is this kind of literary device in the text is so impossibly high. No wonder she doesn't find any. She wouldn't find any even in a completely fictional text, right? Just the first point in the flowchart, like, these are all the things that you have to hit before you are allowed to conclude that they're in fact a literary device. And so some of them are unknowable because you can't go back in time and like investigate what the motivation of the author, or what the motivations of the authors were, right? But the very first thing is, can it be harmonized? If yes, then we don't have to conclude that there are devices. But the problem is that you can harmonize any text, even fictional ones, right? So yeah, it's not surprising. And by the way, like, denying that the ancient authors actually used these devices is like, I don't know, like denying that the ancient Rome existed almost. Like, she's not only is she going against what classicists say, she's going against what the ancient historians themselves say about each other. So yeah, that's just completely ridiculous. Yeah, and I think it should be it's important to explain what the undesigned coincidences are. So the basic idea is that there are these subtle details where, like, one gospel mentions something and the gospel mentions something related, and like they don't overlap, but they kind of like fit together as two puzzle pieces, or like a hand and a glove, right? And it's supposed to show that they are narrating what actually happened, because it's like unlikely these details would be there by coincidence, and they are too subtle to be there on purpose, right? But yeah, like, you can find undesigned coincidences even in fictional texts. It's not difficult. And you don't even have to say that they are there because the authors intended to put them there. The problem is that there is pretty much no methodology for how to identify undesigned coincidence. It's like so loose that you can start seeing it. Like, if you apply that what they are doing consistently to any other text, then you will suddenly start seeing undesigned coincidences everywhere, right? Because their just criteria is too broad. I've done some like finding of undesigned coincidences myself. I don't know if you want to bring this up now or later, but yeah. So let's put up number 5, because that's a nice example of an undesigned coincidence, right? That she would probably subscribe to. And so the idea is that you have the calling of the disciples. And in the Gospel of Matthew, there is this detail mentioned that the Gospels were mending their nets, but it doesn't explain why, like what happened to the nets that they need mending. And of course, in the Gospel of Luke, there is a famous passage of the apostles miraculously caught so many fish that the nets broke. So you have this, like, the Gospel of Matthew describes an effect, but it doesn't describe the cause. And the Gospel of Luke describes the cause, but it doesn't mention the effect. So you have like these two details that are complementing each other. That supposedly shows that the two authors who didn't know about each other are describing a real event. So I actually tried to find some undesigned coincidences myself. And I can tell you that I found one undesigned coincidences, which is completely new, and nobody, at least as far as I know, has come up with it. It's number 6. It has to do with the cleansing of the temple. So in the Gospel of John, the Gospel says that, okay, hold on, I'll just maximize it. The author says that Jesus made a whip of cords, which is not mentioned in other gospel. And in other gospels, such as Mark, for example, he describes how he drove out various people. And Mark specifically is the only one that mentions that additionally he didn't allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. So just like the undesigned coincidences with the mending of the nets, here one gospel describes the cause, so Jesus making a whip of cords, and the other gospels are describing the effects. And now the question, what's wrong with this? Because Lydia McGrew would not like this undesigned coincidence. And can you think of a reason why? She wouldn't like it because she actually thinks these are two completely different events. Because you have to remember, in the Gospel of John, the cleansing of the temple, which would get you killed, by the way. Like, if anyone actually tried that, he would be arrested and probably killed on the spot. And this is obviously based on Ezekiel. Like, this is Mises of Ezekiel, because Ezekiel does the same thing a couple hundred years earlier. So, but in the Gospel of John, the cleansing of the temple appears right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, but in the synoptics, it's basically one of the last things that he does before he's arrested. That's the thing that
right. So Lydia believes there's two cleansings.
Yeah,
most other Christians believe only one.
Yeah, because otherwise she would have to say that John moved the cleansing of the temple to the beginning of Jesus' ministry, but that would be a fictionalizing literary device, right? So here I was able to find an undesigned coincidence, which is pretty similar to other instances of undesigned coincidences that she identified, but she wouldn't like it because it goes against what she's saying. And the thing is that you can take various versions of the same Greek myth, for example, like Antigone or Electra, and you can use the exact same strategies that she uses to find all kinds of undesigned coincidences, even in completely fictional stories. So this isn't any evidence of anything. And by the way, when she says, like, you have to bring in assumptions about how Judas was hanged, do you know what she's referring to?
Well, she's probably referring to that you're assuming that he wasn't up for days and then his rope broke, or that it was an hour or whatever. Yeah.
Well, there is a harmonization which says that he was hanged by his feet, not by his neck. So when the rope broke, that's why he fell headlong, right? But like,
that's why I never could choke anybody out in high school, is because I would strangle their ankles and they never passed out.
Exactly. It's like, yes, I am bringing in an assumption that when the text says he went and hanged himself, he didn't hang himself by his feet. But like, is it an unreasonable assumption to bring, given what we know about how people tend to hang themselves? And this is what I'm talking about. Like, they don't give a fuck about how probable the harmonization is, as long as you can cook up anything that's going to be good enough, right? But you can do it with fiction. You like pick up a fictional book, like two books that describe the same fictional event. People do it with Star Trek and Star Wars. You have these like fan theories about how contradictions in different movies by different screenwriters, or like between different episodes in Star Trek, can be harmonized to create like a consistent lore. This is not difficult. Yeah, I mean, it's very good that she's not a criminal detective, because I think she would never, if she was consistent, she would never conclude that an eyewitness is not telling the truth, because she would always find a way to harmonize two contradictory eyewitness reports.
And I think if you were to see it done in other religions, maybe you can see it in yourself, but I'm not so sure Lydia can do that.
No, well, I think that wouldn't impact her at all, because she's just said, I'm doing it with Plutarch, right?
Right, that's true.
But that's the problem. Like, you can do it with any text that doesn't, even with fictional ones, that doesn't actually show that the text is being historically reliable, right? And this is something that I want to do in my free time, because for the myth, the story of Electra and the story of Antigone, we actually have at least three separate versions of the myth, which is like fairly long and fairly detailed, by Sophocles, Euripides, and Aeschylus. And I actually want to harmonize the contradictions and come up with undesigned coincidences to show that, yeah, that's easy. Yeah, and with Mormonism, it's much more difficult to do, just because we have such a good evidence that the religion was started as a scam, right? But there are still 10 million Mormons. And the reason why there is because, yeah, you can do these harmonizations and these rationalizations even with such a bad religion, right? So this isn't really proving anything. Yes, you can harmonize it. You can come up with a version that's consistent, but the question you have to ask yourself is not, can you do it? The question is like, is this expected on the hypothesis that these are actually descriptions of what actually happened? Or is it more expected on the hypothesis that these are four different versions, like fictional narratives, of authors that didn't know about each other, that were just based on like some common oral tradition or some ideas, right? Like the idea that there was an empty tomb. Like, if four different people try to write down a different story, you would expect these kind of differences, right? And then, even if you had four different fictional versions of a fictional story, you would still be able to harmonize it, because you can harmonize anything. The problem is that now she's giving herself like even more tools to weasel out of the idea that the text is not reliable, right? Like, imagine if she was as easily as she's letting herself off the hook. Come on.
What's that, Camille? This is the most
This
important.
is the most important part. Like, listen very carefully to what she's saying. It's amazing. Like, imagine admitting this publicly and like not thinking about what is it that you're actually saying, right? This is like gold, because this is basically what we are saying is going on with apologists. And I can imagine we are often like accused of like psychologizing or ascribing motivations to people. But here she's basically admitting what we are saying about apologetics all along. Yeah, so listen very carefully.
So interested in the argument from undesigned coincidences. And these are these interlockings where one gospel will explain another. So, for example, John mentions that the Passover was near at the time of the feeding of the 5,000, and Mark mentions that the grass was green. And the grass would be green around the time of the Passover was. So that's just one.
This was we already talked about undesigned coincidences, but it's like I remember even Cameron Bertuzzi thinking that undesigned coincidences weren't that great, and he brought up the I think it was this example of the grass being green. It says that Jesus was crucified in or was doing a certain miracle in spring, and that's when the grass would be green. And look, they say these two things, it fits like a glove. And to me, it's like, this is not, if I was a Christian, I'm thinking, this is not powerful evidence that the Gospels are reliable, especially if you have Mark open in front of you.
Small, simple example of how they fit together. That also shows that they weren't making up details. So that thing about the grass being green, that it's just the grass was green, and that's why they fit together like that. So I became very interested, and that's when I wrote Hidden in Plain View. Also, Tim and I had been tapped back over 10 years ago to write the article on the resurrection of Jesus for the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. And they were very generous. They gave us a lot of space there. And we realized that the reliability.
Was she about to say they gave us a lot of money? They were very generous.
No. This is probably the most important sentence in the entire interview. They realized that, and listen to what she says.
Let me rewind it a bit here.
and they were very generous. They gave us a lot of space there. And we realized that the reliability of the Gospels was really central, because one of the premises we were using there was that the witnesses claimed what we find in the gospel resurrection accounts, that like they could touch Jesus, they were talking with him. So these were not later embellishments. This is what the witnesses claimed. And then,
Okay, we realized, I want to quote her exactly, we realized that the reliability of the Gospels or the New Testament are essential. Essential for what? Who cares if they're reliable or not? This is the issue here. The issue is, this is what gives her meaning, hope, purpose, eternal life. This is essential that it's reliable. Otherwise...
And just like, what's even more specific, reliable about what? About the resurrection appearances, right? Because there are basically two things to the case for the resurrection: the empty tomb and the resurrection appearances. The empty tomb, I think Christians can see that, yeah, it can probably be explained away. Like, maybe the body was stolen at the time when like nobody noticed. You can work out some things that's not very implausible. Or maybe there wasn't an empty tomb at all, and that's why it shows up only 40 years later in the Gospel of Mark. But then you have the resurrection appearances, and unless you can establish that the disciples could really physically touch Jesus' body, that Jesus really did eat a piece of fish, then you're screwed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So she says, we realize that this is very important, and that's why I dedicated my entire career defending this, right? So it's not that she became convinced because this is where the evidence leads. She everything she's doing is doing because she's doing it because she realizes this is like the crucial piece in the resurrection apologetics.
Right.
And if it's even plausible that the gospel authors could invent some of the details in the resurrection appearances, even if they sincerely believe that Jesus was actually raised, which I think the gospel authors obviously were sincere believers, then you don't have a case. Yeah, and she of course thinks that all of the books in the New Testament are by the traditional authors. So, for example, when 2 Peter says we don't follow cleverly devised myths, but we were witnesses to Jesus's glory, right? And he refers to the Transfiguration. She is imagining Peter, like the fisherman, sitting down and writing it on a papyrus scroll, right? Yeah, exactly. And it's important to realize, like, she feels so threatened by what's Lacona doing, and Lacona is still granting the traditional authorship, right? So Lacona thinks that the gospel authors felt free to invent details, even details in the resurrection appearances, even though they were still apostles or disciples of the apostles. Imagine how much worse this gets if you conclude that the Gospels were actually written by anonymous authors 40 to 60 years later, probably not based on any eyewitness testimony, probably based on oral tradition that we have no idea like what it was like, where it came from, how it developed over time and stuff like that. Yeah, so I understand like why she's doing what she's doing, and I understand why Lacona is doing what he's doing, but yeah, for someone who's looking at it from the outside, this is hilarious. Yeah, it's a good thing that like she did all of the investigation and she found out that her original position is correct. And she's happy about it because that means that like Christianity is true, right? She doesn't have to give up what she believes.
Yeah, I have her on record saying that she's willing to die for Christianity.
Yeah, I mean that's the scary thing, right?
If you're willing to say that maybe some things in the New Testament just wrong, then you don't have to do this charade. But again,
yeah, and elsewhere in this video, Lydia, for example, says that the reason why different Gospels record different last words of Jesus is because some eyewitnesses were standing closer to the cross and some others like further away. So they like heard, I guess Jesus like shouted some of the last words, but he was like whispering some others, you know?
Yeah, which is interesting because in Matthew, just says women were watching from a distance. It doesn't even say they were listening or could hear anything. Mark says the same thing, that some women were watching from a distance when Jesus was on the cross. Luke says that, there was people watching from a distance, but no specific names. And then John, the Gospel of John is the only one that says that there was one disciple near the cross, and that was the disciple whom Jesus loved.
Now, isn't it amazing how he shows up in these like very particular points in time in the narrative? It's almost as if it was a text that was written way later, and the author felt the need to explain why is it that no one's heard about this before, right? So he's like protesting too much by saying this is definitely true. This guy was there, and he's still alive, even though it's like 100 CE, 70 years after the crucifixion. Well, it's interesting because there is one text, and it's quoted by Lydia in her blog. He once said, I don't know what's going on. This is Mike Lacona. He said, I don't know what's going on, but here's like one possibility. Little was remembered of Jesus's childhood. So Luke and Matthew invented most of the details, right? So it's true that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. It's true that he was born of a virgin, but everything else, everything basically that only takes place in one gospel, but not the other, is invented. Which means, like, if you imagine the nativity scene, like the Christmas nativity scene, and you start removing the pieces that are only in one gospel and not the other, you have nothing left, right? Just the Holy Family. That's one point. And the other point, this is really juicy. Lacona says that the reason why the accounts could be fiction is because little was remembered. And he still thinks that the Gospels were written by Matthew and Luke, and he dates them early. And what's the amount of time between Jesus' birth and when the Gospels were written, right? I think he would probably place them around 60. So he thinks that in like 60 years, little was remembered, even though there would still be eyewitnesses around, like Mary, Jesus' mother, right?
Yeah, 30 years
And what's
later.
the period of time between when the crucifixion took place and when we think the Gospels were written?
Yeah.
So if he can say little was remembered after 60 years, maybe he would say 40, let's say. That's the same amount of time between 30s and 70s, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's reasonable to say little was remembered about what was going on after the crucifixion. Like where Jesus appeared, to how many people. Did he eat a piece of fish? Did someone touch his wounds? Were there multiple people seeing at the same time? How many? Which ones?
So you're saying that Lacona is saying that because we have these differences in irreconcilable differences within the gospel narratives, especially as talked about with the birth narratives, he's saying, well, it's just because they didn't know, they didn't remember about Jesus's birth. And
So they made it up.
So
The reason why they are different is because they made it up. And I'm saying, why can't I say the same thing about the resurrection appearances? They are different as well. But here, Lacona would say, no. We have to harmonize them. We have to say, yeah, Matthew says that Jesus told them to stay in Jerusalem. Well, but they anyway went to Galilee.
But you know the answer,
because
right?
Because the other two Gospels have the appearances in Galilee. So yeah, when it comes to the resurrection appearances, Lacona completely throws the literary devices out the window, because that's the one thing that he needs to happen, because otherwise the resurrection apologetic doesn't work, right? If you allow the possibility that some of the details of the resurrection appearances didn't actually happen, then like all bets are off. Yeah, the problem with the infancy narratives isn't necessarily that they are contradictory. The problem is, and the reason why Lacona thinks they are so difficult to harmonize, is because one gospel mentions something and the other one doesn't, and it happens all the time, right? So, and if both of them are describing the events as they happened, it's extremely improbable that this is what you would see. But if your hypothesis is that these are two fictional events, two fictional accounts that are drawing on like a common prior sources, like some oral tradition, interpretation of the Old Testament and stuff like that, this is exactly what you would see. You would expect two different authors of fiction to come up with two different fictional stories. And the fact that you can harmonize it is not significant, because you can harmonize fiction no problem. Do you know when Luke says immediately?
When?
He says in Acts that Paul had the Damascus Road experience and he went immediately to visit the Jerusalem apostles. But in Galatians, Paul says specifically that he spent 3 years in Arabia preaching the gospel before he went to Jerusalem for the first time. So apparently, when Luke says immediately, it can mean 3 years. So even if Luke said they went immediately to Jerusalem, Lydia McGrew would still be able to say, well, maybe he meant after 3 years in Egypt, right?
The killing of the 2-year-olds from Herod, like, do you think that happened in history, Lydia?
Yeah, like, does she, for example, think that Luke interviewed Mary, Jesus' mother? Because if not, like, because you should, like, a lot of apologists claim that the infancy gospels go back to Jesus' parents, and that Matthew's source was Joseph, and Luke's source was Mary. And the reason for that is because Matthew only narrates dreams and angel appearing to Joseph, and Luke only narrates angels appearing to Mary, right? Or an angel appearing to Mary.
Right.
So that would kind of make sense, right? Like, if they are based on eyewitnesses, that would make sense that, like, they both had one of the parents as an eyewitness source. So if you think that, do you think that Mary forgot about the flight to Egypt, and that's why it's not in Luke? Or, like, did she thought it's not important to mention to Luke? Did she forget about the slaughter of the innocent?
That's a great point. You're saying that because of the whole initial, how she became pregnant, it's from her perspective. So a lot of Christians think that she was interviewed. But then if her perspective, if she's telling the story, yeah, why would she leave out telling the author of Luke, oh yeah, by the way, we went to Egypt for 2-3 years.
Yeah, and you have to also remember there is one important witness to the infancy story that at least some of the gospel authors had access to, like direct access to, and that's Jesus, right? So I think the best candidate for the eyewitness testimony about Jesus's birth, for Matthew at least, would be Jesus himself. He could tell Matthew what happened at his birth, right? Especially if you think he was a
good point.
divine being. So, come on. He also is corroborated by Josephus. Like, the reason why apologists think Luke is reliable is because he agrees with what Josephus says.
Oh,
and I think it's because he actually used Josephus as a source, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking that, like, if you're saying, oh, Luke's reliable because it goes hand in hand with what Josephus said. Well,
and you know what's really interesting? Like, imagine, like, this is everything that Josephus mentions about Jewish history, about his history of Palestine. And everything that Luke mentions about the history of Palestine is inside it, right? Is it really probable that we would observe this if Luke wasn't using Josephus as a source? Like, wouldn't we expect him to mention at least some of the things that are not in Josephus? Like, one of the pieces of evidence, and there are others, for thinking that Luke actually used Josephus as a source is because everything what he says about Palestine can be found in Josephus, which is what you would expect if he used Josephus as a source.
But then that would put the dating of Luke after 93, right?
He would have to have Antiquities of the Jews, which was published in Hebrew first, I think after 70, and then it was published in Greek probably in 93. But it's okay because, like, Luke Acts is dated usually to 80s or 90s anyway, so it doesn't push it that far.
Well, if Lydia was here, I would ask her, isn't it reasonable, Lydia, that Luke got some things right and some things wrong, the author of Luke? Isn't that reasonable? And I don't know how she would answer that. I think part of it would say, yeah, that's reasonable, but we just don't have any evidence that he got anything wrong.
Well, and also that's not what historians, like contemporary historians, do with ancient history, right? Like Herodotus is extremely reliable when it comes to his description of the Persian Wars, but then he says that in India there are gigantic ants that are mining gold from the underground, right? So you wouldn't then conclude, well, because Herodotus is so precise about the Persian Wars that there really were giant ants mining gold in India in antiquity, right?
Like she says that you should cut Luke some slack because he has a track record and so forth. But I can just envision Mormons saying, cut Joseph Smith some slack. You know, he might have got some things wrong, but he's a reliable source. It's happened to him. And I can hear Muslims saying, cut Muhammad some slack. He was even illiterate, by the way, you know. And
ancient historians occasionally like invoke supernatural stuff as well, and they obviously attribute it to pagan gods. So, like, should we believe it as well? Should we believe that Romulus was a son of a god and stuff like that? Yeah, that was just one thing that I wanted to say about the infancy narratives before we move to something else, and
okay.
it's like the problem with that, with the infancy narratives, and the reason why they are so difficult is because like they are clearly different, telling two different stories, and there is very little overlap. And there is one thing, I think you skipped that, which is fine. She says that this isn't the problem because you could tell two very different stories that are nevertheless about the same person, and she actually uses herself as an example because she was adopted. So she says, you could tell this story about this girl with this name and this father, and then you can tell a completely different story about a girl with a different name and different family, and they would look like they are completely different, but they are actually both about me, so that's fine. And he actually says that her husband, Tim McGrew, once did that at a conference. So he basically started by telling these two stories, and then he revealed that they are actually both about the same person. And she specifically said, and the audience thought that he's crazy. And I'm wondering why the audience did that. I think it's because when people tell stories, they usually don't do that, right?
Right.
And this is the problem. Like, she doesn't care how probable the harmonization is. As long as it's possible at all, she's happy with that. And she's actually, in fact, she's positively thrilled about it, right? But the problem is, yes, you can, in theory, tell two different stories about the same person. But the problem is, that's not what people do. So it's very improbable that this would actually happen if the two Gospels are both describing what actually happened. But it's not unexpected. It's actually expected if the two Gospels, the two infancy narratives, are actually two fictional stories by two people who didn't know about each other. That's what we would expect. That's the problem. This is what's not clicking, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think she goes after Lacona, Keener, and Craig Evans. And this is amazing because she's basically doing my work for me. So I don't have to go look for these literary devices proposed by these people. She's basically cataloging them for me, and I can just take them and say, okay, we can't be confident that Jesus ate a piece of fish in front of the apostles, because even very conservative evangelical scholars think that the gospel authors were free to invent details, and that 40 years is enough for little to be remembered. If we found like two different longer endings, and there are actually 5 different versions of the long ending of Mark in 5 different manuscripts, manuscript traditions. Like some of them have more than one manuscript. This is one of the reasons why we think the long ending that we have today is not the original one, because there is actually multiple different versions. So if we found the original one, how would we know that it's correct, right? We wouldn't.
Well, because Mark would have signed his name and dated it. That's how. It's just like he did with the other. Oh, I guess not.
That would be great.
Well, like the New Testament claims that Jesus was known all throughout Judea and Samaria for doing miracles. It says that in 2 different spots.
He was followed by thousands and thousands of people.
And yet we have no historians other than the New Testament in quotes, historians, mentioning Jesus.
And it's not like there aren't, and it's not like there weren't historians that we know of that were writing about history in that specific period of time, right? Well, there is Josephus, who supposedly mentions Jesus, but he's not the only one. Like, we know there were other historians that were writing about history at that particular region, at that particular time. And it's very probable that if they mentioned Jesus, later Christians would preserve the texts, or they would at least quote it, because that's what they do with other things. The three Gospels, one of them was written by an apostle, so a person specifically handpicked by Jesus. None of them happen to mention any of the highly exalted claims in the Gospel of John. Is it probable? Would you expect that if they were actually written by eyewitnesses describing the events as they happened?
Well, here's an example. It's like, before Abraham, I am. What? You mean Mark didn't happen to think that was important, or Matthew or Luke? Come on.
Yeah, and if you can really quick bring up for the flowchart number 4, I think that's the last thing that I want to show. Yeah. So Lydia and McGrew taught me how to believe any text. It doesn't matter when it was written, by whom. Doesn't matter pretty much what's in it, right? So you start by presupposing that what the text describes actually happened, and then if there are the same details, well, that's just multiple attestation, which is good. That's an indicator of historical reliability. If there are non-overlapping details, well, those are undesigned coincidences, so that's fine. They are also markers of historical reliability. And then if there are apparent contradictions, then you have to harmonize them. And you can do it almost always, even if the text is fiction. And it doesn't matter how probable they are. And really, like, what I want to do is to get some different versions of the same myth from antiquity and do this, basically. Like, be an apologist for historical reliability of the murder of Clytemnestra, for example, by Orestes and Electra.